On your syllabus and on the weekly page on Sakai, you will have links to your Lab 4 assignment. You will also have links to a skeleton for that assignment, a set of files that you can start off with to program this assignment. The assignment is create a future value calculator using the folder Lab4 FV Future Value Skeleton and template that I have provided. Before going further, let's see how this program is going to work. You have a nice form here, Future Value Calculator. I'm going to type in an investment amount and a yearly interest rate and the number of years. And let me calculate what my results are going to be. Beautiful. Now let me do it again. This time I'm going to put the dollar sign there, which I'm not supposed to do, although there's really no indication that I shouldn't. Yearly interest rate and calculate, and I get an error message that it has to be a valid number. Now let's do this all again, and this time let's pay attention to the URLs. I supplied to you a set of files that I call a skeleton because it's kind of a bare bones version that you're going to have to fill in. And it has two main files, index.php and displayresults.php. Main is just a CSS file to make sure that your error message shows up in red. Let's run this again, and let's take a look at the URLs and see what happens. First, I simply go to Lab4 Future Value. Well, I'm looking at the key because mine is a solution. But Lab4 Future Value Key. Now, as we said, when you go to a certain directory, if you don't specify a file name, it's going to go to index.php. So we see that the first thing it's going to is index.php, which means that either we have a form on that index page, or we can have another form.php or form.html file that is included in index.php. That's probably the better way to do it. It's the way we've demonstrated it in class, but for simplicity purposes for this assignment, I did actually put the form inside of index.php. Now I'm going to fill in my form correctly, and I'm going to press calculate. When you click on your submit button in a form, it's going to go to wherever the action said it should go to. And the action in my form must have said to go to display results, because that is the page, if we look here in our URL, that is the page that it is displaying right now. So my display results.php clearly takes the information that was posted, and I know it's a post and not a get, because I don't see a question mark here, takes the information that was posted by index.php in the form and displays it in some pretty way in Future Calculator. Let's go and do this incorrectly now. And now again it went to displayresults.php, and it's telling me the error message. It does display the same form again, and it's telling me that the investment must be a valid number. Let's talk about how we can achieve this. It looks like it's doing this in displayresults.php. Well, that's a little confusing to me because the form itself seems like it should be in index.php. Unless it's including index.php, how are we going to achieve this? So let's talk a little bit about this. Figure 1, the first page. This is how the form is displayed if nothing has been entered yet. The form is displayed by the index.php file. Now, again, for simplicity purposes, I actually have it in my index.php file, but you don't have to. You can have it displayed in a form.html file and include that in your index.php file. Again, within index.php, here's the correctly completed form. When the user clicks calculate, the action of the form says to go to displayresults.php. Now let's go look at your skeleton. Don't worry about calculating the future value itself. I actually give you the entire loop that does the future value calculation. What if the user doesn't enter something correctly? Below in index.php, just like my demonstration, the user entered something with a dollar sign, which is a non-numeric character. In displayresults.php, since that is the page that actually displays the results, before displaying the results, the program will test for valid user input, which in our case is to see if this field is numeric. If it's completely valid and everything's fine, it simply displays the results after doing the calculation. But if there are errors, then we're going to include the index.php file again because that is what displays the form. And this is going to explain something a little bit unusual that we saw in our URLs. We know that displaying this form occurs in index.php. We saw it the first time. We see here, if you look at the URL over here, we see that the form is displayed. Remember that if we just see the directory, it means that our form is displayed in index.php. But if there is an error, then we see that the same form is displayed in displayResults.php. So do we actually have the same form twice? There are two different ways to handle this. One is to have a separate form.html that I can include in my displayResults.php page, and I can also include it when needed in my index.php page. The way that I did it here, just to do things a little differently, is to actually include index.php in displayResults.php. Therefore, that's what I wrote, that in displayResults, you do your test, and if there are errors, then you should include the index.php file. So actually, this form is being displayed from the index.php file, but it has been included now in displayResults.php. That's why this URL is showing. So you get to reuse the code that way. You simply include it into DisplayResults. And I give you different ways of doing this. This is a different way that I showed you in the welcome example in class. So this is one way. It's the way I'm showing in this example. Or in our welcome example, in form.html.php, notice that it says action equals empty string, method equals post. What this means is that when the user clicks on the submit button, it's going to go to wherever the action says. In the past, we've had a URL over here. Action equals empty string means it's going to reload the same page that it's currently on. Well, what is the same page that it's currently on? Is it this page? Not really. Because what really has happened in this example is that form.html.php is included in my index.php file, which means it's like cut and pasted right here. So when it says action equals empty string, the page that it's going to load is the page that the form is currently on, which is index.php. That is why we were able to test for is set to say, is this the first time index.php is being shown? If it is, include the form here. And the next time when you click on the form, it reloads this page and it will fail this test and it will go to the processing part. All we are doing here in displayResults.php with this example is we're dividing those things up into two separate pages. But I don't care which way you do it. These are both valid ways of doing things. You can use a post back if you want, the way we did in our welcome example, or you can do it the other way, the way that I am showing it here, where displayResults.php, if there is an error, it will include the index.php file right there within displayResults.php. One of the points of this assignment is to see that you understand how these includes are working and how the tests and is set and things like that are actually working. Let's look at your files. Let's start with index.php. So I gave you some comments. These are HTML comments to kind of guide you along, so that really if you can figure out what to do every place where I have a comment, then you should be able to write this program. This is a link to a CSS file. The point of this CSS file is to display your error message in red. Clearly we can't really go through all of HTML and CSS, but I just don't want you to think that these things happen by magic. We're going to have a portion of what I did in the example that I showed you. Is I had a portion of the form identified as content, and here you can see that it has a border of navy. That's why my form showed up with a border of navy around it. In addition, I applied some style to my labels. I applied some style to my buttons. I applied the error, dot error. It's red, and font weight is bold, so that the error message will show up in red and bold as long as I specify for that paragraph that the class is error. So we'll take a look at how that is done. Once you know how to reference these things, you don't really have to worry about the CSS at all. This is the skeleton for index.php, and if you could figure out what's going on in these comments, you should be able to at least get a good start on writing the program. This is the link to the CSS file. This is the div ID equals content. That's why the style for content that you just saw in the CSS file will be applied to this entire div, which goes down all the way to the end. This is an HTML comment. Display or echo an error message here if there is one, if the error message isn't empty. That means that clearly we're going to be using an if statement here. So what are we going to be testing for? Well, you know that you could simply test for is set. We have used is set before. Is set error message. There is something else that you could test for, and that's called empty. I put a link onto Sakai right by the instructions for this lab to explain the differences between is set and empty and is null. As far as the true and false test itself, is set error message will be true if it does have a value. Empty will be true if it does not have a value. If the error message is empty, then you don't need to do anything special. If the error message is not empty, then you want to echo the error message. So you probably either want to test for it to be is set or to test for it not empty. So right over here is where you're going to want to do that test. You're going to want to test for the error message being not empty. And if it is not empty, then what do you want to do? Well, you want to echo the error message. You want to be careful that when you do this, if you want to take advantage of the CSS, which you really don't have to, but if you do want it to show up in red, be sure to enclose your echo statement into an HTML paragraph where you specify for that paragraph that the class is error. Then you can go ahead and put in your PHP here to echo your error message. And that's the end of your PHP over here. That's a closed PHP tag over here. And then you also want to close your paragraph. So that means that everything in this little paragraph here is going to show up according to the style of error. That's just if you want to incorporate the CSS. If your error message does not show up in red, that's okay too. But that would be the way to do it if you want to apply the style of the class error to your error message. And this can be right smack in the middle of your if statement. In other words, if your error message is not empty, then now you're going to have to be careful here with what you're doing with your PHP. In other words, this if statement, this is PHP, and the brace for my if statements is all PHP. This, do this in another color here, this is HTML. This is HTML. That's HTML. This is HTML. And this part here, echo, is PHP again. So look at the interplay here that I have between HTML and PHP. We're starting off with PHP. So I have to say this is PHP. Then I say, okay, stop PHP for a minute. And I want you just to directly use some HTML here. So we have our HTML, P class equals error. And then I'm ready to write more HTML, but the HTML that I want to write is whatever the error message is, so I have to use PHP to echo that error message. Then I'm done with that PHP. Then I'm back to HTML to say now close my paragraph. So that's how you would handle this. What about creating a form? Well, you want to create a form very much the same way as the forms that we have done in the past. When the submit button is clicked, the place that you want to go is to our second file, displayresults.php. So that would be your action. Your method is going to be post because I tell you to use post, not get, so that's going to be your method. So the action is going to be displayresults.php. Your method is going to be post. And I do give you a form, just a very basic form that you could start with. This is going to take advantage of some of the CSS. We saw some CSS before for buttons and for data. So if you specify it with an ID of data and an ID of buttons, then whatever we have defined for our CSS for data and for buttons will be applied to that particular section of HTML. look at some of the forms that we did together to see what kind of label you're going to want to do here and what kind of input you're going to want. Clearly, you're going to want some kind of a text box for the investment amount and some kind of a text box for the interest rate and some kind of a text box for the name. In the comment, I mentioned something that might be a little bit confusing. I'm saying the values that you want to display in the text boxes can be PHP variables instead of just blank boxes. What we've seen in our past forms is we simply specify that there's an input box, a text box, and it's blank. And that's perfectly fine for the very first time that the form is displayed. But recall that if we filled out our form and it had a mistake, we then wanted to reload the form with those values that had already been entered showing up in the form. If this was an error, notice that when it reloaded my form, it's reloading them with these values showing up. These values are PHP variables. Therefore, you may as well, every time that you complete your form, fill it with a value of whatever the PHP value is. Let's give an example of that. What we've done in the past, for example, is we'll have a label, and we'll say that our label is, in this case, investment amount. And then we'll say we have input of type text, and we'll give it a name. So we'll call it investment or whatever it is you want to call it. And this is standard, and you can copy this off of any of our forms. And that's all we had. What we want to do this time is you want to say value equals. Now on our submit buttons we always had a value because we wanted something to show up on the submit button. So there's no reason you can't have a value in a text box also. And what is our value going to be equal? Well, this is all HTML. But for our value, we want to extract a value of a PHP variable. So we want to have our value equal to, now value is supposed to be enclosed inside of quotation marks, like type equals, and we enclose text inside of quotation marks, and name equals, and we enclose name inside of quotation marks, and value equals, and we enclose our value inside of quotation mark. That's just HTML. I haven't done any PHP here yet. Now I'm going to do some PHP. What do I want to display as my value? Well, I want to display my PHP variable, so let me switch on over to PHP here. And what I want to print out as part of my HTML here, I want this HTML to consist of value equals quotation mark, whatever the value is of that investment. For me, it was $100. And you want to do the same thing for the other text boxes so that they will all get filled in with whatever your value is. So this was my investment, and this would be my interest rate, and I would be filling these in with my PHP variable values. And the first time, I can still do it because if it's an empty string, then it's simply not going to print anything out. It's going to print that empty string out. So it'll work whether it's the first time or whether I am reloading my form and displaying it again. So that pretty much takes care of my index.php. We talked about how we're going to have to display our error. We talked about how we're going to print our values inside of our form. We talked about what kind of a form we want to have, what the action and what the method are going to be. So now let's turn our attention to the other file, displayResults.php. The first thing you're going to want to do, clearly, in order to display any results, you've got to get the results. So you have to get the data from the form. Use the post superglobal variable, and you know how to do that. We've done that in some of the lab examples. And you take, for example, your post variable investment, and you assign it to a local PHP variable, which you might want to call investment, or you can call whatever you want. I gave you a couple of things to validate here. We talked specifically about validating the investment entry to see if it's empty, to see if it's a positive number. You also want to make sure that it's numeric. Assign an appropriate error message to error message in all cases. So this is a little bit more complicated than what I had originally said. And the truth is, I'm not that particular on how many different kinds of errors you test for. I really want to make sure that you know how to test it and how to make sure that that error message shows up on the form when it's supposed to. But as long as you're doing data validation, you may as well do a little bit more comprehensively. So you certainly can test to see if any of the entries are empty. You can test to see if they're positive when they're supposed to be. You can test to see if they are numeric. And all of these things you should look up in the PHP documentation, and there is a link on Sakai for this assignment for the PHP documentation. You should look it up and see how to test for something being numeric and so on, and to do a range test. It's really not all that much different from any other language. Set the error message to the empty string if there are no invalid entries. The empty string is 2 single quotes. And I gave you this. If an error message exists, include the index page. If your error message is not equal to an empty string, in other words, if you do have an error message, then you have to display your form again. And the form is in index.php. So we can include that form right here. How does the form start again? Index.php starts right like this. Nothing much happening until we show the form. It shows the future value calculator. It basically shows this whole page again, and then it shows you the form. Is there another way to do this? Absolutely. You can just have a separate form.html page and include that. You can do that if you like. Make sure when you test this that you test it with all the different kinds of possibilities. Test it with no errors. Test it with 1 error. Test it with several errors happening serially. Exit will allow you to stop execution. What happens if you do not exit is you will display the form, and everything else in the page can also happen. Well, we don't want that to happen. You can try it without the exit and see what happens. You could if you want, and we saw this when we used our isSet, when we were testing to see if a certain variable had been set. You could put something under the if part, and then you could have the rest of the page under else. You can do that, or you can just exit after the if segment. If everything's okay, if the error message is equal to the empty string, there are no errors, that means it's time for me to calculate the future value and display my results. I gave you the calculation for future value because I'm not expecting you to have accounting or finance background. I could have just given you instructions on how this should be calculated and have you do it with the for loop. I'm assuming most of you are at least somewhat familiar with a for loop, but perhaps not familiar with future value. So this is the calculating the future value. By the time you finish executing this for loop, the future value of your investment should be stored in the variable future value. And again, things for you to look up. Apply currency and percent formatting for the 3 variables. You can look up number formatting. If you want to, you can just concatenate a $sign to the formatted investment value. You can concatenate a percent, or you can go and look up in the PHP documentation different kinds of ways to format your numbers. I make a comment here that you could have started your HTML earlier, and in fact, we have seen on some of our example pages where the HTML tag comes first and then you insert PHP in it. That is all true. Many programmers prefer to begin with the PHP tag when you have a PHP page. So right now it is a question just of preference. Here is our HTML page for displaying our calculator. So I gave you the title, and we're still going to use our CSS. And we have a header saying future value calculator. And you don't need to create a form here. You are not inputting anything. Taking a look at what our results are supposed to look like, you can simply just echo these values, display them, and you should be okay. The blue border, that is going to come again from the CSS. You don't have to do that. You're given the CSS, and I have actually put the ID that you're going to need to take advantage of that CSS over here. So it's really just a question of echoing the appropriate variables. I think that this should give you a pretty good head start on working on this lab assignment. You need to complete this lab assignment in order to get credit for your lab, and you are allowed to work on this lab assignment with 1 other person in the class. Good luck, and of course, if you have any questions, you can post them to our questions discussion board on Sakai.